have been millions of dollars have been thrown at them when we don't know if they actually are going to go ahead. Those are your words, not mine. So how many projects do you believe are at risk that you have already done the announcements for and that you have already spent money on?
Appreciate the question, and I appreciate the replay of my adage, which, yes, I heard from an old construction hand many years ago. I think the sentiment behind it is clear. It's that large infrastructure projects are complex. They often take years to come together. This one has taken a decade, and it's still going through that. But to answer your question directly, there are two other projects that I'm aware of that are in a similar suspended state. One was a power project in northern Quebec. It's called the Wapmagustui project we announced in partnership with Indigenous communities in Hydro-Quebec. Again, cost escalation for that remote construction made it such that the project was paused. And the other was a project with BC Transit around the purchase of zero-emission buses for BC Transit, where we were working on a deal with all levels of government, and that project has also paused. Those are the only two that I'm aware of. I would say
on those two projects, sorry, I don't have much time. Sure. On those two projects that you've just listed, how much did the CIB spend on external? How much money has already been gone out the door? How much taxpayer dollars has already been spent either by the bank or by external consultants that may or may not ever be useful to Canadian taxpayers? How much have you already spent on those projects that are at risk of being cancelled?
Appreciate the question. We've answered this in previous members' question, an OPQ question. I'm happy to provide the figures. Mr. Duguay has them.
As previously reported, Mr. Chair, so for the BC Transit zero emission project that Mr. Corey is referring to, those costs total close to $85,000 in total for legal expenses and also technical advisory expenses. And on the Wapmagustui project, as previously reported to Parliament, those costs total about $185,000, again, for between legal expenses and due diligence and technical expenses as well.
Okay, so getting close to $1.3 million between these three projects, which are dead, that might be revived. How much time, Mr. Chair?
You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. The other question that some of these questions I would prefer to ask to the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, who is the minister responsible for this and through whom the CIB has their parliamentary accountability. However, he has declined an invitation to appear on this study, even though he was invited by motion of this committee. So I'll ask you, he provides to you a statement of priorities and accountabilities, which is interesting considering that he won't be accountable to this committee on this issue. But he has stated that he believes that the Canada Infrastructure Bank should become a center of expertise. Now, as Dr. Lewis has pointed out, you've gone from 17 million to 21 million to over $30 million now in staff and bonus costs. So you're clearly expanding the size of the CIB's cost to taxpayers in terms of its number of employees or salaries for those employees. Do you believe that you are a center of expertise on infrastructure? And if so, why, like the government, which has expanded the use of external consultants to $21 billion a year, why the need to use so many outside consultants if you are an infrastructure center of expertise?
Thank you for the question. So yes, it is a core part of our mandate, as you say, and as outlined in our statement of priorities and accountabilities. And we are absolutely fulfilling the role of providing advisory support. So, as I was mentioning in response to an earlier question from MP Rogers, our role starts with providing advisory support to the potential borrowers. It could be a public borrower, province, municipality, or Indigenous community, or to the private sector in how to structure these types of investments. We do that. We're doing that on projects like Georgina Island, where we're working with a First Nation on the potential to build a new road that connects their community, or Tulsan, which is a hydroelectric project in the Northwest Territories. We're working with the government. So yes, we provide that sort of advice on how to structure a deal. When they get to the detailed stage of investment, that's when we would bring in the third-party expertise and due diligence. And as Monsieur Duguay was describing, that would usually be both for legal, but also market and technical support. Notwithstanding that we have an incredible staff, there are market-by-market understanding of what's the demand and the offtake and what's the reasonable construction cost that we would go to a third party for.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Corey. Next, we have Mr. Biddle. Mr. Biddle, excuse me, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I guess looking back, CIB isn't the first time the federal government's been involved in public-private partnerships, and the previous government was involved in P3CF, which is the Public-Private Partnership Canada Fund under the previous government. I know Mr. Strahl was here at that time. Would you be aware, would due diligence have been done at those times and under similar models? If you can explain, if you were aware of what would have been done at those times.
For sure, I appreciate the question, and I'm not personally aware. I joined the CIB in late 2020, but I can say that I have every belief that they would have conducted a similar type of due diligence. Certainly, when you're investing Canadian taxpayers' money, making large-scale loan agreements like we are, I think that's an expectation that you as parliamentarians would have of us, and so I assume they did similar. In my old role, I used to work for the province of Ontario at Infrastructure Ontario. We certainly conducted similar types of technical due diligence. For instance, if we were investing in a new highway or a new hospital, we would hire a cost consultant to help us estimate was the cost reasonable, to give an example. So it's very standard, at least from my experience, and I'm sure P3 Canada did similar.
I wondering if you could speak to the private sector. We're talking about the CIB like it's operating in this vacuum, that it's the only one that would hire lawyers to conduct a $600 million loan and be shocked that there'd be costs coming from it. I was wondering if you can explain, perhaps from the private sector experience that you've brought with you, how a bank would operate in a similar type of experience if loaning out hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on a file.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I would say two things. One, let's just use Lake Erie as an example. If we were structuring these legal agreements, and you, I think, may have opportunity as committee members to ask the proponent of the project, whether that's Fortis, if you've invited them, or NextEra, perhaps, who may be taking over the project, ask them this question. But very clearly, our lawyers were interacting with their lawyers. Our technical advisors were interacting with theirs. And there was an earlier question about not believing the marketing materials of the proponent, and I want to be very clear. The proponent also did a technical study and had their own estimate of the GHG savings. They had their own third-party consultant do that. Respectfully, that's their number. We need to have our own independent view of that, which is why we hire due diligence. But absolutely, the private sector is doing the same on their side and then some. And I think that's reasonable and to be expected in these types of large commercial agreements, which is what the CIB was set up to do.
Do you have any sense of what the proponent spent in terms of getting this project off the ground to even get to a point where you're involved, or perhaps that's just a better question for them?
Apparently, Mr. Gunratna does have an idea, but I will just say in general, before we've spent $1 on a project, proponents have spent millions of their dollars. I could give you many examples of project proponents and the types of investment they have to make to get a project off the ground. In this case, Mr. Gunratna, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would. It was between $10 and $20 million that they spent of their own money to bring the project from when they got involved until it was suspended.
Thank you so much. And I guess looking at it, I know it's been touched briefly on in terms of the Ontario government bringing forward an infrastructure bank. And I know our government and their government don't often see eye to eye. But I was wondering if, I know CIB has become a bit of a political football, but if it was such a failure of a model, can you comment as to why the Ontario government set up a very similar model within the province?
I would never suppose to speak for them, but I've had lots of discussions, I think, in their lead up and in their planning. And I think similar to us, what they see is that we have a very simple problem. All of us agree we need more infrastructure at every level of government. It's actually one of the few, you talk about it's one of the few issues that actually has unanimity. I could ask a mayor or a premier or a prime minister of any political party. They would all agree we need to get more built faster. Number one. And actually, the reason we don't is very simple. We can't afford it all. the cost of our infrastructure needs exceed our ability to, and there are studies that talk about the hundreds of billions of dollars needed to be spent in this country. And so the only way to do that is find a way to draw in private and institutional pools of capital into these projects. And the only way to do that, they're big companies, but they also make smart investment decisions based on math. And for many of these projects that are very long, 20, 30, 40-year lives with high uncertainties, is to find a partnership. That's the whole point of public-private partnerships, where we can share with them, not take, but share with them the risks of those projects, the upfront investment hurdle of those projects. And that's what the CIB is here to do. And I think Ontario sees that as a way to similarly draw more investment and more infrastructure built at the end of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Biddle, and thank you, Mr. Corey. Next, we have Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to go back to questions that my colleague, Dr. Lewis, was asking, because in the fiscal year 2023-24, or sorry, fiscal year that ended 2022-23, the CIB had $46 million in operating costs, and of that, 8.1 million were bonuses. So that's 18% of your operating costs. That's bonuses. That seems like a very excessive amount. And do you think that's justifiable? And certainly that can't compare to what the private sector is paying.
So appreciate the question. In that same fiscal year, let's just start with with a general sense. The CIB made investments in projects of our money of $4.3 billion in projects that had total capital value of between $12 and $13 billion. We did that with an internal staff of just over 100 people in offices in Toronto, Montreal, and Calgary. And our compensation structure is benchmarked rigorously to the private sector. We hire from a pretty wide sector of Canadian banks, professional industry groups. We hire engineers. We hire investment professionals. People who work at the CIB come because they believe in the public sector mission of the bank, and they take compensation that does not match what they can get in the private sector, but it does need to be at least competitive. So that's why we benchmark. And it's a mix of base salary and bonus that is benchmarked. And we're extremely transparent in what our performance goals are and if we meet them or not. And that's what our performance compensation is linked to.
I would find that 18% of your operating expenses being used on bonuses to be excessive, but we'll disagree on that. When you were last here when you were here, I think you were here since then, in May of 2023, so just about a year ago, I asked you about internal audit processes and transparency, and you talked about the need to improve transparency, but yet we're looking at a project today that's been shrouded in secrecy. We've had to have questions in question period. We've had to order paper questions in order to draw out some of those details and find out the volume of taxpayer money that's been wasted. And so I guess my question is this what you would view as an improvement in transparency?
So appreciate the question. And maybe just in answer to the follow-up, just to be clear, at the CIB, our internal costs are only made up of salary and staff costs, some office rent, and some computers. We're a knowledge-based organization, so the fact that salaries make up the majority of our expense is actually not in my mind surprising. The balance between base compensation and variable compensation, as I say, is designed to make our performance transparent and our compensation linked to actually meeting the tangible goals we set, not only in dollar deployment, but in achieving outcomes like number of new homes connected to broadband, number of Indigenous communities with access to better infrastructure, et cetera. Now, to the question about transparency, I think the CIB, have made significant investment in our transparency. And Monsieur Duguay, who, as our general counsel, also leads much of our work around transparency, can speak to this. But our publishing, whether it's on our internal expenses, our salary costs, you're quoting to us our salary costs because we try and always provide up-to-date, accurate, and transparent information around all of the money we're spending, including on projects, including on third parties, which you can also see in our reports.
Sure, although we had to produce order paper questions to extract some of that information. Let me switch gears and ask Mr. Winfield then. you talked in your opening remarks about audit practices and you know, I guess grounding for projects. And it seems to me that from what you described here, that it was fairly obvious quite some time ago that this particular project was not one that was going to be successful. That the assumptions that were being made were not were off base. And so, you know, here we have $1 million of taxpayers' money wasted, majority of which, by the way, on lawyers and not engineers, for a project, you know, of this type. So, I mean, what's your comment on that? I mean, in terms of this seems to be avoidable.
Yes, I mean it's a little complicated because sometimes you have to spend a little bit of money up front to recognize that there's a problem, which does potentially avoid a much bigger expenditure down the road. So there's obviously a rationale for spending some money on a project if you're going to take it seriously. The questions arise though is you know, what do you do with that initial analysis? I would have thought anybody looking at the Ontario electricity system at that stage would have had some pretty serious questions about where this was going and where it fit. And so the fact they proceed anyway is the part that worried me more. You know, as I say, sometimes that upfront investment in the due diligence makes sense to avoid the bigger loss down the road. And some people might point in the direction of Muskrat Falls that way. The problem was the upfront assessment was ignored. So that would be my comment there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Winfield. Next, we'll go to Mr. Yacono. Mr. Yacono, la parole est à vous. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie
You have 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Corey, I really enjoyed your statement where you indicated that even once a project has been suspended several times, there's always a hope that it will be reactivated. That means a cat has 9 lives. It's a bit like that. So let's speak about its raison d'être, its reason for being. And you mentioned this. You answered questions by my colleagues, whether or not there were other projects. You said directly that there are 2 others. Could you explain the reasons behind this? Why this suspension? Is it because the project is no longer viable, or is it because of the costs of producing the projects? The costs that arrived or that might occur in the future by surprise. Thank you for that question.
2 things. Every project has 9 lives. I think that's another way of stating, maybe more eloquently, my earlier point. So I appreciate that. What's interesting, of course, is construction projects in this country went through a significant challenge in and around the time that this project was suspended around cost escalation. And as I said, committee members here would know better than anyone what has happened in the tightness of our labor markets, global cost of materials, whether that's steel, the concrete that went into these projects. There have been huge increases. So if there's a trend I could point out, because it's true for the Lake Erie Connector, it was for sure true for the Wamagustui hydroelectric project. Between the time that the idea was launched and there was an alignment between parties and we signed a term sheet between there and final investment, what happened in those cases was significant cost escalation. And to Dr. Winfield's earlier comment, much better to discover that in that due diligence phase than later. The reason those projects are suspended and that they have 9 lives is the underlying rationale for them remains very strong. The need for new sources of clean power in northwestern Quebec didn't go away. The need for better transmission connectivity between Canada and the U.S. did not go away. So in the long term, the project has real viability still in our view.
Merci. Il est intéressant de constater que mes collègues
Thank you.
conservateurs
It's also interesting to see that my conservatives and my other colleagues here at the committee are questioning the value of the CIB, whereas the Conservative Premier of Ontario has announced his own infrastructure ban. So I'm wondering this. Would you agree in saying that the announcement of the Ontario infrastructure bank announcement is an approval of our current model. Thank you for that question. I always try to stay away from political issues. At the CIB, our role consists in increasing infrastructure investment in Canada. Yes, but the fact that Ontario will have its own infrastructure bank, will this facilitate your work in order to see more projects being carried out in Ontario? Yes, good question, and absolutely yes. According to our view, this is a true opportunity for a partnership between us and the Ontario Infrastructure Bank. This will increase the number of projects for us, and I hope for them as well. I imagine that that's the case.
All of us need more infrastructure. I look at that and say, all of us need love. So just tell us, you've been in this field for quite a bit of time. Since 2015, has infrastructure doubled compared to the previous 10 years? And is that due to the CIB?
So, thank you for the question. The idea of an infrastructure bank, to be clear, we're a tool in the toolkit. So we don't presume, and we're pretty humble about this. It takes all of us. And to answer your earlier question about the Ontario Bank, someone once asked me, like, oh, are you going to be competing for the same deals? There is enough to go around. We need all hands on deck to build the infrastructure we need. We are one tool, and I think there's a great opportunity. But directly answering your question, yes, we are now the projects the CIB has invested in the last 3 years since I joined, or in the last 5 years since we staffed up, represent $35 billion of infrastructure projects that were stuck on the sidelines. The math didn't work. The risk was too big. The term was too long. There's something broken. And the market wasn't doing those projects on their own. And the CIB, by entering, helped facilitate those projects. So yes, I think we've played an important role in accelerating infrastructure investment in the country.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your involvement with the REM in Quebec.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corey. Merci, Monsieur Iacono. Monsieur Barcel-Duval, à vous la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Iacono. Mr. Barcelo-Duval, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to take this opportunity to come back to the 900,000 consulting fees. It seems to me that that is an important amount. I'd like to come back to that. Over that $900, $800 represent legal fees. I believe it's $25,000 for financial expertise, $60,000 for expert knowledge in electricity and GHG's knowledge, but $800,000 legal fees for American and Canadian markets. We all keep in mind when we're speaking about these expenses, we receive bills, we don't pay, we don't look at them, we simply pay, like it happened with ArriveCan. I'm not saying that that's the case here, I don't know. But we do need to have that instinct to be worried when we see such high figures. And I think that when you look at high figures, I think at the end of the day, we tend to lose sense of what is real. That's 800,000, 800 million, etc. So for the ordinary Canadian, what does this mean? $800,000. And I'm sure that your consultants are not paid $20 an hour. They're usually quite well remunerated. But are they paid 10 times more than this? That means that would have worked 4,000 hours on your project. Perhaps it's less, it might be more. But could you give us a sense of the overall amount? So how many companies were involved? What would be the hourly rate? What is the average hours they've devoted to this project? This seems to be extremely high, and I'm trying to understand this. I'll give it over to Mr. Dubé to speak to that issue. Thank you for that question. Well, there were a number of questions. If I may, first of all, I'd like to answer the general procurement issue, the legal services. For legal services, when we reach a point where an investment moves ahead as part of our investment process, and when we find ourselves in a negotiation, legal drafting phase, as well as due diligence phase of the project, essentially decision is made as to the fact that we require perhaps on-site expertise. We have a legal team working with us. We have some 12 lawyers who also work in partnership with our investment teams to structure the project. But for this type of major project, for this billion projects, we simply don't have the necessary staff to manage the project internally. So we do require outside expertise. Now, with respect to procurement, well, and also vis-a-vis our commitments to transparency, and again, this is all available on our website. With respect to legal fees, we have a project process in place where we launch a call for tender. On average, 3 to 5 legal firms are approached to first assess what is required. We also assess the hourly rates that are presented for a given project, and we ensure that there is no conflict of interest. But more specifically, how many hours of work are we speaking about? How many hours were billed? Because it's always the number of hours worked when it comes to lawyers. I'd like to get a sense of the average hourly rate. Let's look at the connector project. I think the CIB was involved as of 2019 on this project. In 2021, we had provided approval on the investments of 355 million. And I think for several months there were important negotiations underway, not only with third parties. Could you perhaps provide us with that answer in writing? Because perhaps we don't have time to get that right now. I think it would be very interesting to obtain the hourly rates for that. Mr. Chair, yes, we will provide this in writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking through the communications that came out around the time that the bank, approved in principle its participation in this project, and I'm not finding any mentions of importing power from the United States. So we have a quote here from Mr. Corriveau with the bank, who said that the expectation is that energy will flow from Ontario to PJM over the long term, given that Ontario has a much higher share of lower marginal cost sources of supply, which is typically non-emitting compared to PJM. Again, this is directly contrary to what we heard from Professor Winfield. In the press release that the CIB put out, here's a quote from you, Mr. Corey. This project will allow Ontario to export its clean, non-emitting power to one of the largest power markets in the world, and as a result, benefit Canadians economically while also significantly contributing to greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the PJM market. Let's go down and hear from the then Minister, Catherine McKenna. What does she have to say? With the U.S. pledging to achieve a carbon-free electricity grid by 2035, Canada has an opportunity to export clean power, helping to reduce emissions, maximize clean power use, and make electricity more affordable for Canadians. It just seems like an incredible sales job when the actual rationale that you've explained to us today was that in the midterm, you're going to be a net importer of American power, and in the long term, probably also a net importer of American power, whether clean or otherwise. Why didn't the bank come clean at the beginning and articulate that this, largely was going to be a project that imported American power to Ontario?
Thank you for the question. I'd love to clarify. We're using short and middle and long terms in probably different senses. And let's just go back to some core facts. This project, remembering that the project will both import and export power throughout its life. It's a net question. First 10 years, 4 million tons of GHG reductions estimated by the ISO and verified by our external advisor in Ontario. So that's from importing power instead of turning on a gas plant in Ontario in the first 10 years. 7 million tons of reduction in the US in that same time frame. Go out longer term. Those benefits continue to accrue on both sides of the border at slower rates because all markets become tighter. And all markets become cleaner. And so the amount of GHG emission savings gets less and less over the 40 years of the life, but they continue on both sides of the border. The project, over the 8,760 hours in any given year, will both import and export. I think I stand by everything in the quote you read from my quote from all the quotes, but certainly mine remains true. Everything I said is true. It is a great opportunity for both for all three of grid reliability, economic benefit, and GHG benefit for Ontario and Ontarians. And the Minister of Energy in Ontario, Minister Smith, in his ministerial directive issued in 2022, thought the same, as does the independent system operator.
The thing that stands out to me, Mr. Corey, is the lack of any mention of importing American power. And it just, I'm not sure why that is. Maybe because it's less palatable to Canadians to invest so heavily in a project that's importing electricity from the United States. But be that as it may, there's a real question based on what Professor Winfield has said, and he's studied this in great detail, about the core rationale behind the project and whether or not it's actually going to, because Ontario is now awash in fossil gas electricity. And looking forward, as we heard from Professor Winfield, emissions are going to go through the roof. And I think that's something that should concern all Canadians and should certainly concern the Infrastructure Bank. But given that I only have 5 minutes left, 20 minutes
20
left?
seconds, sir.
20 seconds.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, you're so generous. I would like to move the following motion. That the committee do order all documents and correspondence related to the Canada Infrastructure Bank's modeling and analysis of the greenhouse gas implications of the Lake Erie Connector project, and that such documents be delivered to the committee no later than May 15th, 2024.
Thank you very much, Mr. Backrack. Any discussion on that? Any comments? Questions? Yes, Ms. Katrakis.
I would like to ask for suspension, please, to discuss this a little bit further.
Okay. The committee will suspend for 5 minutes to allow members to discuss. The meeting stands suspended. I believe, have been discussions while we were suspended, whereby the witnesses have agreed to resubmit the information that's already been submitted by the date, the latest date put forward in the motion. And do you want to withdraw your motion, Mr. Bachrach?
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I understand that the witnesses did provide some information and not everyone on the committee was privy to that. So perhaps something was missed. And if that information indeed answers the questions that we have around the modeling and analysis, it'll be very helpful. So I'm happy to withdraw my motion for now, and we can look at the information that's been provided. And if we still have further questions, we can bring back a motion at a future date.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach, and I'll work with the clerk to ensure that all that information is once again redistributed to all members. Okay, we will now resume line of questioning, and for that, I'll turn the floor over to you. Dr. Lewis, you have 5 minutes, please.
Yes, Mr. Corey, I understand that Andre Lee's method was appointed to the Infrastructure Bank Board, and she previously served on the board of SDTC, a billion-dollar green slush fund company with under multiple investigations. Now, Ms. Method had a interest in companies that received $42 million while on the SDTC board. Do you know who appointed Ms. Method to the Infrastructure Bank Board?
Thank you for the question. Appointments to the CIB board are it's an independent board of directors appointed, Frederick can help me here, but appointed by the government.
Yeah, so in accordance with our act, our directors are appointed by the governor and council. That follows the open and transparent process for director selection process that is used across government, across agencies of government and crown corporations.
So it was suggested by probably someone in government. By cabinet.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Ms. Koutrakis.
Yeah, I'm just questioning relevance to the matter at hand that we are looking at today. I just want to have a better understanding the relevance of your line of questioning vis-a-vis what we are looking at today.
It's on transparency and largely the way that the taxpayers' funds are used, which ties into the wasted funds that we saw on the Lake Erie project. So it's all around the issue of transparency. And my next question pertains to that with respect to the apparent conflict of interest that is raised. Have you raised an apparent conflict of interest with Ms. Method?
Mr. Chair, so we, with our board of directors, have adopted a code of conduct for directors that includes our procedures for conflicts of interest. That's also publicly available on our website. So upon Ms. Method's appointment, and I would say upon the appointment of all directors who are appointed on the board of directors, directors have to complete a director and officer questionnaire to disclose material interests. And if there is any project with respect to that would raise a real potential or apparent conflict of interest with a director, that is managed appropriately with respect to that director recusing themselves from the meeting and the voting on the matter, and also excluding materials from the director.
So specifically, can Canadians be assured that monies did not go to Ms. Method's businesses that she has ownership interest in from the Infrastructure Bank?
We're speaking about two different things. So there's a conflict of interest on a project that a director may have a conflict. They may have a conflict where it's direct because they sit on the board of directors of an entity that we may provide a loan to, or it may be indirect or perceived because they may have a close family member or a close friend that is related to that particular project.
Right. So
in that situation, the appropriate approach with respect to managing a conflict of interest is through disclosure and recusal, and that's how we manage conflicts that may arise on our investments with respect to entities that may be related to our directors or that they may have.
But Canadians see an apparent conflict, and they want to know that they want assurances that money from the CIB did not go to her companies when she was sitting on boards that were affiliated with it and then sitting on the CIB's board. Can Canadians have that assurance is what I'm asking you. Do your processes guarantee that assurance?
Our processes are robust such that directors are required to disclose all of their interests on boards that they serve and in respect to their private interests. And we are robust in our procedures
Mr.
in
Chair.
managing those conflicts.
Sorry, I have a point of order. Yes, Mr. Biddle.
I have to agree with Ms. Koutrakis. This is a study with respect to the Lake Erie connector, and I thought there was going to be some tie back from this individual back to the Lake Erie connector, but it seems to be I know we're talking about Lake Erie and there's fishing that goes on Lake Erie, but this is a broad definition of fishing and has seemingly zero connection to what the committee is actually studying.
Thank you, Mr. Biddle. Thank you. 30 seconds left, Dr.
Okay,
Lewis.
will you be paying bonuses this year from the CIB?
So as I mentioned earlier, thanks for the question. We publish our balanced scorecard that we measure ourselves against, and that's goes to Parliament. It's part of our disclosure. We, for the year that just completed, March 31st, we are still are in the process of tabulating our results for the year, taking those to our board, getting approval. So too early to say, but if you were to look at our balanced scorecard, we have met or exceeded many of our objectives.
Thank you,
We've
Mr.
missed on a
Corey.
few. And it's the board's discretion from there.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Lewis. And we'll end today with a line of questioning by Ms. Koutrakis. À vous la parole. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci
You have the
beaucoup.
floor, 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Witnesses for being with us here today and for answering all the questions to the best of your ability. It's definitely very helpful to this committee. Mr. Corey, I want to go back to your testimony before this committee on May 9th, 2023. At the time, you had said, and you said it again in your comments today, that due to cost escalations, both the CIB and the private sector operator, ITC, and I quote, deemed that given the cost increases on the Lake Erie Connector project was no longer good value for money. Do you continue to share that opinion today, having heard that, there is a new partner that's looking at it? Do you still feel the same way?
Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. I would honestly say it's a bit too early to know for sure. The new proponent who acquired the rights to the project around the new year, December or January, are doing their own work on revised cost estimate. As I said, 2022 was particularly challenging from a escalation of core inputs perspective. It's also, as I mentioned earlier, a very specialized kind of construction. This is trenching. There's only a few boats in the world that can actually do this kind of deep trenching and laying of a high voltage bidirectional cable. So you also have to worry about when you can get a boat that can do this. So the new owner, who I think may be appearing before the committee, have been doing some work. The answer to your question for us is, as investors, it's our job to receive their updated cost estimate. On the other hand of that equation, the government of Ontario is doing their modeling and updating their modeling, and they need to determine their updated view of the value to Ontario ratepayers. Because at the end of the day, what this contract is a contract between the ISO, which represents Ontario ratepayers. They're willing to pay an amount for this line. And if that math has to work. So the province of Ontario has to determine that they want to proceed at a price that they're willing to do, and then we can lend to the project. So that's what we'll need to figure out in the months ahead. But as I said earlier, better grid connectivity across east and west across our country, but also north and south with our neighbors. A more robust grid makes more reliability. It makes lower power prices for everybody, and it makes better GHG outcomes for everybody. And so in the long run, we hope that this project and many like it do proceed, and we'll see.
Great. And who was responsible for the decision to suspend the Lake Erie Connector project in the first place?
Was the the proponent themselves, because quite simply at that point they had negotiated a price from Ontario, they had a loan from us, they had their own private financing, and they had their return hurdle rate. And then once their costs went up, the project didn't pencil for them anymore, and they couldn't do it. So they decided to suspend.
Was the CIB ever consulted before the cancellation?
We were, and as was Ontario, but frankly, the proponent had to do their math in their commercial interest, and at that point, they couldn't make it work. We weren't going to put more money into the project. Ontario wasn't going to increase the price, so that left it to the proponent to decide, and they obviously decided they needed to suspend.
Do you need to incur additional due diligence costs by going into this?
Yeah,
Next era.
MP Murray was asking this question, I think, a little bit earlier. We will build off of all the work that's been done to date, and it's extremely useful. But we will, for sure, want to do an updated look at both, all three of project costs, GHG impacts, and then the legal documentation and finalizing of what is a pretty hefty contract. So there will be some more due diligence costs. They won't. They will all build on what's been done to date.
You said in your opening remarks that the due diligence cost for this project represents less than 0.1% of CIB's announced investment of $655 million. Is that a regular rate? I mean, my background, I worked at CIBC Wood Gundy for many years and then Raymond James, and I remember seeing many IPOs and term sheets. Is that a rate that's competitive? Would you say it's below? Are fees expected to be higher than that? So where are we in terms of value received for the $900,000?
That's a great question. And so we do benchmark it across projects, and the due diligence costs of this project were higher than average. And you heard me when I was talking about the other two projects that have been suspended. If you notice, those numbers are much smaller. So this is a more complex project. But as a percent of, it's also one of our largest, it would be one of our larger investments. Our largest investment to date is the REM, which was $1.3 billion. We have other significant investments in the $500 million to $1 billion range, but this is a big one. So the due diligence costs were higher, but as a proportion of the investment, they're quite small and highly competitive. And when you benchmark to, and we do as well, when we talk to other institutional investors, when we talk to the pension funds, they would say that it's actually quite a competitive rate. And the last thing I'll say about that, one of the things that the CIB we've been very focused on is bringing that cost down, thinking about standardized tools and projects. So this is a very bespoke project. It's a one of one. No one else is building wires underneath Lake Erie. But when we do loans for zero-emission bus fleets, which we've done with the City of Ottawa, City of Brampton, Durham Region, school bus operators in Quebec, etc., we've tried to create standard documents, standard legal terms,
Thank you.
lower due diligence costs. So we are trying to do that on every deal where feasible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corey. Thank you, Ms. Katrakis. And a thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing before us today and for providing their feedback and their testimony to this study. I will now adjourn the meeting.